We shall commence this module by discussing about the foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment refers to the investment made by residents of the rest of the world in the home nation in equity capital or real estates or physical capital. For example, if a European automobile firm sets up its automobile manufacturing units in India for the production of automobiles, then the amount spent by a European firm to set up its factories and plants is called the foreign direct investment. If an American businessman opens up a new joint stock company in India, then it is termed as examples of foreign direct investment. It should not be confused with foreign institutional investment, that is FII. Also called foreign portfolio investment, which is the investment made by the residents of the rest of the world in the stock market of the home nation. Although both FDI and FII are part of the foreign capital, but FDI is in the form of equity capital, so it remains more stable as compared to FII, which is in the form of debt capital, which remains highly volatile. As the economic conditions of the home country turns bad, FII starts moving out of the country. They exhibit herd behavior and are a friend of good weather. Inward FDI versus outward FDI. Inward FDI refers to the investment made by the multinational corporations in the host country. For example, if an London, UK based MNC set up a plant in San Francisco, US then from the viewpoint of US, it is an inward FDI. Outward FDI refers to the investment made by the home country in the rest of the world. For example, if US based multinational corporation sets up a plant in London, UK, then from the point of view of US, it is an outward FDI. However, in this chapter, we will keep our focus on inward FDI only. The determinants of FDI. Now the question arises, what factors determine the foreign direct investment in home country by the rest of the world? It is quite important to have the knowledge of set of these factors, because by improving these factors, more FDI can be introduced in the domestic economies. Various empirical studies reveal that foreign direct investment depends upon the size of the market in terms of consumers and sources of the raw materials for manufacturing final products to utilize the relatively cheap factor of the country as compared to the world. Good economic prospectus and sound financial condition of the economy. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the meaning of FDI, know the pros and cons of FDI, understand the term of trade and its determinants, understand the pattern of trade in goods and services in the world, know international trade and anti-globalization movement, debate over free trade versus protectionism and WTO and trade agreements. Now we shall discuss the pros of FDI. Foreign direct investment by the MNCs or foreign industrial houses helps in meeting the gap between savings and investment. The economic growth depends upon the rate of growth of capital formation. In underdeveloped economies, people are not able to save much of their income due to their low level of per capita income. So, the availability of foreign funds eases the domestic budget constraint. FDI also helps in maintaining the balance of payment in equilibrium. Developing economies generally export the agricultural and primary articles, while import heavy machinery, equipments and engineering and manufactured goods whose prices remain generally higher as compared to prices of the primary articles. Developing nations hence face the problems of balance of payment deficits. In this context, MNCs play an important role by financing import requirements for the production purposes on their own and in this way help in reducing balance of payment difficulties. Foreign direct investment also helps in improving the technological progress and managerial efficiency. FDI not only brings financial capital but also brings the technical knowledge and managerial skills which are the prime catalyst to accelerate the growth rate. Technology used by the developing nation is old and outdated and proves to be costly, while MNCs utilizes the updated technology and improve the skills of their workers using training and skill development programs. Like international trade, FDI ensures full utilization of resources available in the economy. FDI brings the economy closer to the or on the production possibility frontier of the nation. The most important feature of foreign direct investment is that it is not the debt capital for the country like borrowings and FII. It is the equity capital of the nation and therefore is not volatile like other components of the foreign capital. FDI is the more stable and ensure more certainty in the economy. Moving on, the cons of the FDI. Although there is a theoretical argument that foreign direct investment by MNCs helps in promoting competition in the domestic economy, but sometimes this competition is so intense that it endangers the existence of domestic producers. Once the domestic competition is over, MNCs may hike the prices and exploit the consumers. Although we have discussed earlier that FDI made by the MNCs eases the balance of payment difficulties, but MNCs do repatriate their profits and royalties to their home nations. Generally, salaries and perks given by the MNCs are quite high and return in terms of foreign currency put a pressure on the balance of payment situation. Foreign direct investment by MNCs may not always lead to the increased employment of the domestic workforce. These MNCs sometimes employ the men of their own countries and do not even share their new technology with the domestic producers. FDI is said to be responsible for accentuating the industrial imbalance in the country. Real investments by the MNCs takes place at those places which are abundant with natural endowments and factors of production and large markets. These are generally the areas which are already well developed from industrial point of view, while the other backward areas now become more backward in a comparative sense. Foreign investments take place in those products which are generally used by upper income class group. The products like Cadbury, Uncle Chips, Pepsi etc. are not important items for the poor class. The lower income class is more interested in the availability of the primary food articles which are prime cause of inflation in the resource constrained developing economies. MNCs are the giant corporation having immense money power. They can impose a threat to the sovereignty of the nation. Let us now understand trade as a source of aggregate demand for the economy. No economy in today's world can be called a closed economy. Trade is an important aspect for all the nations. Trade relations are not a new phenomena, but they have in existence from times of Indus Valley civilization, civilization of Mesopotamia, etc. Recall the equation of planned aggregate expenditure, that is AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where AD is the aggregate demand, C the private consumption expenditure, I the investment demand, G the government expenditure, and X minus M refers to the net aggregate demand in real terms for domestically produced goods and services. So for any, the aggregate demand is affected by the size of net trade. Higher the value of net trade, higher will be aggregate demand. The ratio of the sum of export and import to gross domestic product is the degree of trade openness of the economy. For an inward oriented economy, this ratio seems to be relatively lower, while for the outward economies, this ratio seems to be relatively higher as shown in the diagram below. The aggregate expenditure or demand is given by C plus I plus G and C plus I plus G plus X minus M in case of closed economy and opened economy respectively. The equilibrium level of output Y1 is higher in the open economy than equilibrium level of output Y2 in the diagram. Moving on to the theories of international trade. There are two basic concepts in the international trade theory, viz. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage. A country is said to possess absolute advantage if it uses least amount of resources to produce that commodity. So the basis of trade is comparative advantage and not the absolute advantage. Various explanations have been given for the sources of comparative advantage like Ricardian theory, Heckscher-Ohlin theory, increasing returns to scale, etc. Heckscher-Ohlin theorem states that a country will export the goods whose production requires intensive use of abundant and cheap factor in the nation. On the other hand, it will import the goods whose production requires the scarce and expensive factor in the country. For example, if a country is labor abundant and capital scarce, then it will export the labor intensive commodity, say cheese, while it import capital intensive commodity, say manufactured cloth. Free international trade equalizes the product prices both in absolute and relative sense. Not only the product prices converge, but the factor prices also converge both in absolute and relative sense. This is often called factor equalization theorem. Free trade is in fact a substitute of international factor mobility. Although international trade is subject to some tariff and non-tariff barriers, tariffs are imposed to protect the domestic producers, that is, to give them nominal and effective rate of protection. The spirit of protectionism is still alive in the current world in the presence of World Trade Organization. International trade between the two nations does not necessarily mean that two goods exported and imported are altogether different or belong to different industry. For example, if India exports wheat to US and imports computers, so this trade is called inter-industry trade, while the trade belonging to the same industry with product differentiation is called the intra-industry trade. For instance, if Germany exports German-made cars to US but at the same time also import US manufactured cars, this is example of intra-industry trade. Economies of scale also explain a good part of intra-industry trade. It is the increasing returns to scale that causes fall in the cost and hence price of the commodity and forces the country to focus on new specialized products. Most of the world trade now occupies a major share of intra-industry trade. Intra-industry trade prevails most in nations having similar factor endowments, while the inter-industry trade prevails most among the nations having different factor endowments. According to one theory of gravity model of international trade happens to be greater among the nations having similar size of economies. Similarly, culture and language and least distance between the two economies. Now we shall discuss the terms of trade and its determinants. Terms of trade is defined as the ratio of price of export of goods divided by price index of import of goods. It is the interaction between demand and supply of goods traded that determine the terms of trade. As discussed earlier, according to the principle of comparative advantage, all developing economies have comparative advantage in the production of agricultural commodities, so they should be producing primary articles only, while the developed economies have comparative advantage in industrial and manufactured goods, so they should be producing manufactured and industrial products. But this production pattern has some disastrous implications for the developing economies. Since the price of agricultural commodities is quite low as compared to the manufactured commodities, so the terms of trade is relatively low for developing nations. Therefore, the terms of trade of developing economies is deteriorating over years. This phenomena is called Prebisch and Singer deteriorating terms of trade hypothesis. As a small nation can't affect the prices in the international market, its exports or imports is not able to affect the world market prices. So a small nation always faces a constant terms of trade. It is only the large nations' fluctuations of demand and supply that affect the terms of trade of the country. There are various types of terms of trade in the international trade theories. Simple terms of trade are Px upon Pm. It is simply the ratio of price of exports to price of imports, where Px refers to the price index of exports and Pm refers to the price index of imports. Income terms of trade, that is I is equal to Px upon Pm multiplied by Qx. It means the exports based capacity to import, where Qx refers to the volume index of exports. Singleton's terms of trade, that is S is equal to Px upon Pm multiplied with Zx, where Zx refers to productivity index of exports. S means the amount of imports the nation gets per unit of domestic factors of production embodied in its exports. Double's terms of trade, that is D, which is equal to Px upon Pm multiplied by Zx upon Zm into 100, where Zm refers to productivity index of import. D measures how many units of domestic factor embodied in the nation's exports are exchanged per unit of foreign factors embodied in its imports. Moving on to international trade and anti-globalization movement. The labor union of high wage nations like US, UK, Germany, France, etc. oppose the free labor movement in the nation. There is a strong opposition from the workers of industrialized economies having high productivity, which receive high wage rate as compared to low wage paid in the developing nations characterized by low productivity. This movement is called anti-globalization movements. Given the political pressures and strong lobbying by the labor union of the industrialized economy, their governments have to pass the legislation to restrict the labor flow, especially unskilled workers from the developing economies. In this case, initially high wage nation becomes worse off while low wage nation becomes better off. Trade makes the two economies better off in overall sense, but it does not affect the economic agents equally. So, trade increases the welfare of some people while it hurts the other sections of the economy. Apart from this, as per Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the return to the nation's abundant factor rises while return to the scarce factor falls due to free international trade. So, the welfare of the nation's abundant factor rises while the welfare of the nation's scarce factor falls. So, the one section of the people becomes better off while the other section of the people becomes worse off. So, the conclusion is that the trade causes increased income inequality between the factors within the economy. This is the income distribution effect of trade. Free international trade is also a threat to the currently working labor force of the nation. High trade in import of goods and services reduces the demand of domestic goods and services, which causes the layoff the employment and hence reduces the level of national income and hence growth rate. This is the effect of trade on domestic employment and output. Next, we shall discuss the debate over free trade versus protectionism. Arguments against free trade. Domestic employment argument. Mercantilism is still alive in the 21st century. According to theory of mercantilism, free trade is a zero-sum nation. A nation can benefit at the cost of others. A nation becomes rich if it accumulates more and more amount of gold, silver and bullion in the country. So, a country should try to maximize its exports while minimize its imports and hence accumulate the total capital in the form of bullion. Mercantilists believe that wealth accumulation is necessary for the payment of wages, for employing large armies and protecting domestic employment. The domestic employment argument is still valid today that foreign goods compete with the domestically produced goods and reduce the value of multiplier through leakages, that is imports. Anti-globalization argument. High wage nations oppose the free international trade as they know that international trade leads to equalization in factor prices. Income distribution effect argument. This is an argument for the free trade as it is beneficial for all the nations. But trade leads to changes in the distribution of income within the economy. As per Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the return to nations abundant factor rises while the return to the scarce factor falls due to free international trade, resulting in inequalities. This is called income distribution effect argument. Terms of trade argument. Nearly all nations use trade barriers like tariff and non-tariff barriers to restrict the volume of trade. In fact, the imposition of tariff improves the country's terms of trade, and hence improved terms of trade with trade barrier is good for a nation. Infant industry argument. In the initial stages of the development, all sectors of the economy are not equally strong to compete with the foreign sector as they are in their infant stage. They require the subsidy support from the government and protection from foreign competition through tariff on import or custom duties. Once these sectors become mature and strong enough, they can be open up to the foreign competition. Arguments in favor of free trade. Free trade maximizes the joint production of the output through specialization, in contrast with the case of autarky, for example, where a nation's production possibility frontier happens to be the consumption possibility frontier. International trade leads to a right shift in the consumption possibility frontier, providing vast set of consumption choices. Free trade leads to increased competition and hence reduces the prices of goods and factors of production in the international market. The results of increased competition are more desirable compared to less competition. Trade also helps in improving the international relations between the nations. Strong economic relations are today the most important factors in the foreign policy of all nations as compared to any other factor. Trade also helps in accelerating the capital growth rate of the nation. It also helps in import of capital goods and in borrowing from other countries to finance import of capital goods. It also helps in importing the new technology, which is the key source of economic growth. Moving on to WTO and trade agreements. Globalization of agriculture, that is AOA or Agreement on Agriculture. Agreement on Agriculture refers to the commitments for long-term agricultural reforms of agriculture trade and domestic policies over the years with a focus on trade liberalization in agricultural trade. It provides a provision of providing market access, regulating domestic support and containing export subsidies. AOA requires that the non-tariff barriers should be replaced by the tariff barriers and abolished gradually. It required the tariff to be reduced by a simple average of 36% by the developed nations over 6 years ending over 2010 and by a simple average of 24% by the developing nations over 10 years ending 2004. The second most important component of AOA is to reduce the domestic support. AOA divides the subsidies into trade distorting subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. All trade distorting subsidies are called amber box subsidies, while the non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized into green box, blue box and special and differential box. The green box includes the assistance like research and extension, marketing information, rural infrastructure, etc. The support under green box is excluded from any reduction commitments and is not subject to any upper limit. The support under blue box includes the deficiency payment from the government, etc. is also exempted from any reduction commitments, but it has an upper limit. The special and differential box includes investment subsidies, subsidies on various agricultural inputs, etc., which are subject to reduction commitments. On the issue of export subsidy reduction, the developed countries were supposed to reduce the volume of subsidized exports by 21% over 6 years and the budgetary expenditure for the export subsidies by 36% with respect to the base period 1986 to 90. Developing countries were required to reduce the volume by 10% and budgetary support by 24% over 10 years. Subsidies. Subsidies have been an important area of discussion in the international economics. Before we go ahead with the actual issues of subsidies in the context of international trade, the main effects of subsidies is to reduce the amount of cost. So any subsidy received by a seller of a good or producer of a good reduces his cost and he can sell the commodities at lower prices as he gets a part of cost from government as subsidy. The idea of subsidies given to producers is to encourage them to produce the subsidized good and increases the market share of producers by underpricing the other producers in other economies. This is what is actually happening in the case of agricultural subsidies. Subsidies distort the market system and does not let the efficiency creep in. Subsidies in the international trade are against the spirit of international competition. The share of agricultural income in the total GDP for the developing nations is very high and a significant population is still dependent on the agriculture. While developed economies are on the advanced stage of industrialization and service sector and only 3 to 4% population is engaged in the primary activities. It is quite unfair trade practice. Developed economies are providing greater deal of subsidy to their agricultural sector. When they provide subsidies to the agricultural products, then the international price of the commodities goes down as they are able to sell their produce at lower price. So the producers of the developing nations like India are harmed by the process of subsidies given by the developed nations. Although there has been the agreement on the time-bound withdrawal of subsidies bit by developing and developed nations. TRIPS. It is related to the trade in intellectual property rights like patents, trademarks, industrial design. There are two types of patent products, patent or process patent. For example, if a medicine can be manufactured with two different methods, let us say different salt. So here medicine is the product and the methods of manufacturing are the process. Before the Uruguay round, there was lot of divergence on the issue of patents. Some countries choose to adopt the product patent, some choose to adopt process patent and some choose to adopt nothing. But TRIPS made it compulsory to all the members to follow all the conditions under TRIPS. TRIMS. The Agreement on Trade and Related Investment Measures requires that foreign investment should be treated at par with direct investment. There are some investment measures which are not compatible with WTO provisions. Foreign investors to have the obligation to buy local input to produce for export as a precondition to obtain imported goods as input. To balance the foreign exchange outgo on importing inputs with foreign exchange earnings through export. Not to export more than a specified proportion of local production. WTO requires all such kind of provisions to be notified within 90 days of the entry into the force of the agreement and they are required to be eliminated over a stipulated time. GATS. The issue of trade and services was first time introduced in the trade talks during the Uruguay round. The GATS has already been discussed in the previous section. Now let us summarize what we have learnt in this module. Foreign direct investment refers to investment made by residents of the rest of the world in the home nation in equity capital or real estate or physical capital. FDI has various pros and cons. There are two basic concepts in the international trade theory, viz. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage. According to one theory of gravity model of international trade, International trade happens to be greater among the nations having similar size of economies, similar culture and language, and least distance between the two economies. Terms of trade is defined as the ratio of price of export of goods divided by the price index of import of goods. It is the interaction between the demand and supply of goods traded that determine the terms of trade. Developed economies have already experienced the third phase of structural transformation in the economy, which is characterized by dominance of service sector. Major trade services are banking, insurance, health facilities and education facilities, legal and accounting services, etc. Arguments in favor of free trade, WTO and various trade agreements have also been discussed.